everybody. Today's session is called Success as a Non-Families Executive, Managing Up, Down, and Forward. We have an hour scheduled today with my co-presenters, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And we're excited to have a dynamic conversation today. We've got a lot of knowledge, and we're going to answer some of your questions as well. So I think it'll be a great dialogue over the next hour. This is a Zoom webinar format, so you can use the functions at the bottom of your screen to engage with the program today. Again, we are taking questions throughout the program. We'll hold on to some of those for the end, and we may pop those into the conversation from time to time. So please do use the Q&A portion of your interface you can start submitting those now, things that you're hoping to get out of this program. We'd love to hear. We also will provide at the end of this program a post survey about your experience. We really do read those responses. It's also an opportunity to get more information from our FBCG. So please pay attention to the follow-ups on that because we'd love to hear from you. We do record this presentation. It will become available within the next 48 hours. So if you are registered for this program, you will get an email from us with access to that recording when it is ready, as well as another email which will have additional resources that relate to this topic and opportunities to learn more if that's something that you're interested in. A note on confidentiality. We do value confidentiality of families. We value your confidentiality. In order to support that, when we share questions that we've received, we'll do that anonymously. We're not going to identify the people who have posed questions during the session. Similarly, the stories that Robert or Shawna or I might touch on over the course of the next hour, we either have permission to share those stories, or they've been anonymized, or in other ways sort of compiled from client experiences, so that we can share some of our real experiences while protecting the families that we serve. This is also an educational dialogue, so we're going to provide some insights for you over the next hour, but of course, the best practice is only the best practice to the extent that it's a fit for your family and your situation. So please do consult your own advisors based on what you might learn today. Small technical glitch. There we go. So let's introduce our panelists today. Robert DeAngelis. Hi, Robert.
Hello, hello.
And Shawna Lecuyer. Hello, Shawna.
Hi, Christy.
Robert and Shawna are colleagues of mine at FBCG, working with families on a wide variety of activities, from succession and continuity planning, ownership issues. And one of the shared experiences that they bring to today's conversation is that they have both served as non-family executives in long-standing family-held companies. So they've got personal experience to bring, as well as their consulting and advisory experience to bring. And I think that's going to be a great foundation for the conversation. I am Christy Data. I am the president and CEO of FBCG, and I get to serve as moderator today. With that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the conversation. Before we get started, though, we do want to ask one poll question, which we think will help us understand your experience in the room today. And that is, what is the highest level that non-family executives currently work in your company? So you might select management if you have non-family members working in management roles, but not at the executive level role. Executive leadership would be those reporting directly to a president CEO kind of level in the organization, or if you have a non-family member serving as president and CEO, and you might be this person in any of these categories, please feel free to fill those in. I think that'll be really helpful for us to understand the experience of the families that are attending today. We will give this about 10 more seconds. All right. So here are our results. It looks like about a little over a third of you have a non-family president and CEO, or are a non-family president and CEO in a family-owned company. Another 44% have senior level leaders who are non-family members. Robert, Shawna, how does this reflect your experience with families?
I'm pleased to see, I'm a little surprised to see that the 36% for president and CEO. So that's great. I think for a lot of what we're going to talk about is the transition along that management to executive leadership to president, and then some of the dynamics once in that role.
I would agree, because I think a lot of times we see that a family member typically still holds that president and CEO position for a long time. So that's actually, to me, it's very encouraging.
Great. And I know that we'll touch upon all of these experiences over the course of the conversation today, so that will be fantastic. Let's get started then. You both have experiences, I noted, in as non-family executives, as well as advising others in this role. So what do you think makes this topic important for us to be spending time on today?
Well, Christy, I'll start us off. I think that survey results kind of give us an indication of that. There's a third roughly of the family businesses that we're engaged with today have non-family CEOs. And as I thought about this topic, I really feel like we're entering into an era where senior leadership team building is probably changing. There's so much technology, there's so much access to information that really the way senior leadership teams were built 20 years ago is vastly different than today. There's remote work, there's Zoom. So I think the blending of family and non-family skill sets, I think, is an important topic that this revolves around. The other reason this is important is that sometimes it's looked at, this non-family executive leadership role is looked at from one perspective or the other. And I really feel like it's a mutually reinforcing conversation. The family has expectations and the non-family leaders have expectations. And to the extent they dialogue on that and learn from each other, I think both systems, or really all three in the ownership systems, can be improved. And I'll leave it at that. Shawna, what are your thoughts?
Well, I love how you kind of frame that up, and I think it's going to lead us into our dialogues beautifully. But I'd add that, the non-family executive can play a really unique and objective role in the family system, particularly if they're working around a number of family members. I know in my own situation, I worked with G3, G4, and G5. I had 15 family members around me. So our role oftentimes is a little bit different, and I think it can be very helpful. But, setting that non-family executive up for success appropriately, allowing them to, or for you to really leverage their strengths and the talents that they bring to the table, it does take thought and intention. It's not going to happen on its own. So this topic we're speaking of today, success as the non-family executive, I think when done well, it's a collaborative process. It can really ensure alignment and clarity of goals and the needs for the business, and the family and the executive. And I'm really glad we're discussing it, because a successful outcome, it rarely happens without a planful process, and yet the upside potential can really be that great.
Fantastic. I think that's you've hit on some really important things here about this collaborative relationship and the importance of spending time and effort and energy on it. So let's talk about the unique dynamics, the unique opportunities for non-family executives. As we were framing this conversation, we started talking about managing up, managing down, and managing forward. So managing up being perhaps to a family CEO or leader or a family board or ownership, managing down to people who have a strong connection to the family as actual family employees or as long-term employees, and then managing forward. How do you champion the things that you want to do as a leader in a system with family members who are very tied to the whole outcomes emotionally? So we're going to start today with managing up. Many execs may feel that their reporting structure in a family company is a little less clear than in other situations. Tell us about the ways that family firms are governed, and how does this impact a non-family CEO or a key executive?
Well, I'll let Robert speak in greater detail about the reporting structures aspect of this, but I'd like to really hone in on the integration. And just reiterate that effective integration, it starts at the beginning of that working relationship. So from the interview process and certainly into the onboarding process, this is a prime opportunity to establish role clarity, come together and have agreement on how decisions are going to be made, what structures are needed to work through ambiguity. It's also a great time to have dialogues around the family's goals. What are their expectations? What is their expectation around confidentiality? How does your board function? When or where is the executive actually going to interface with that board? And when might they interface with family governance as well? I think that's really critical to explore. In my experience, and I've also recommended this to my clients, I think an executive coach can be a really great tool to use at that initial phase of onboarding. They can help you facilitate healthy and productive dialogues while you're establishing that working relationship. And, as you lean in and you start working together, it's also really helpful, I think, to keep in mind that sometimes best practices in leadership may not always be fully integrated in the organization. And you're going to be discovering these things together. So integrating what works best for the executive and the business while exploring elements of the organization that may need to evolve is really important for success. Robert, what would you add to that?
I think that when you think about managing up and reporting structure, I think it's important to be intentional. The non-family exec is probably surrounded by several family members, or it's possible. Some could be coworkers, they could be working in other aspects of the business, could be board members, could be owners. And I think the reporting structure requires some real intentionality from the non-family member to ask for clarification, the non-family CEO, but also within the family. I think the family has a responsibility in some ways to really consider the impact of multiple conversations that could be somewhat confusing or seen as possible surrogate conversations that are intended for the CEO. That's not to mean that those conversations shouldn't happen, because input is important and it's critical. But I mean, distinguishing between when that is input and when it's meant to be a decision. I'm reminded of a story that I was told from the person who first hired me into a senior leadership role of working with a church building committee. And he was asked to help as a contractor to help build the church or be part of building the church, and suddenly realized there were 6 or 7 people that all had opinions on what color the church should be and how the pews should be arranged. And it was a step for him to learn that he had to ask for that clarity. He had to go to the committee and say, I appreciate the discussion, but I want to make sure that I'm getting the ultimate decision, not reacting to just input and ideas.
I think that's really, really well said. I think most of us have heard that phrase, no man can serve two masters. We, I think, inadvertently set up the executive for failure if they don't have clarity around how and when the voice of the broader family actually comes into play. And, just like a job description, role clarity really serves as a foundation so that expectations can be met. And it allows us to frame how we're going to work. So I think if the person is managing up to multiple people, rather than having clarity on where to go for input versus decisions, they can be conflicted and they can't possibly meet everybody's expectations, especially when it's coming from multiple voices and through various filters.
Absolutely. And Shawna, at the very end there, you hit on expectations. So let's continue to explore that a little bit, because oftentimes when families are recruiting non-family executives, they're focused on what their experience and skills might be and the expectations for the business outcomes that they're looking for. But what the family is often most concerned with is how a new leader will carry forward the values and the culture that are so important to them. So what maybe counterintuitive behaviors would you suggest that a non-family executive think about in, say, their first 90 days to lay the groundwork for strong relationships?
Christy, I'll jump into that one and really start out by kind of assuming from your question and maybe for context that in the recruiting process, there's been some discussion about the immediate need. There's a need to fill a spot. There's a transition in place. Maybe there's a crisis of some kind. So in that sense, assuming that there's some goals to kind of carry the executive and the family, into that first 90 days or 6 months. But for me, the counterintuitive contribution there might be really not going too far without talking about the next layer of goals. Those first set of goals will be met and worked on, but as those get accomplished, and even while they're still being worked on, it's really possible for the deeper level of goals to start to rise to the top. And those can be around growth and income and like use of cash type goals. And sometimes those goals aren't clearly shared within the family or the board or the ownership group. They can also be around some of the values that you touched on. It can be around managing toward longevity versus maybe also managing toward, a certain sense of community service or loyalty to a certain, aspect of the business or stakeholders. So I think it's wise for the non-family executive to look beyond what's on the initial charge and engage the family and the owners in that deeper level. Where do we go from here in 3, 6, or 9 months? And that's an ongoing conversation. The other counterintuitive part that might go hand in hand with that is really taking a deep breath and jokingly, but somewhat sincerely, don't do anything. Do nothing for that first 90 days. The actions that you take, decisions that you make will not be as impactful as the relationships that you build, the learning that you accomplish in those times, the credibility and the trust that you build. So I think it's an important first phase to resist making a big impact. Obviously, it might not be, the luxury might not be there for that, but really the focus should be to end that first period with a deep sense that you are part of understanding, wanting to learn, and can be trusted and will be supported in the role that you have, because it's critical that that group around you, and it could be from, the up, down, and sideways, are really see this CEO is not coming in with the answers, but coming in sincerely wanting to help and understand and listen.
Yeah, Robert, I think that last point is just, it's such wise counsel, because it is counterintuitive to check the desire to come in and make change right out of the gate. And to your point, sometimes you might need to, but it's common for a new executive in any environment to want to demonstrate value and implement changes that maybe in their prior experience were considered a best practice. And in that family held environment, there's often deeply held beliefs or certain systems in place that have historical significance or connections to a key relationship or something that the organization values that may not be obvious to those that are outside the system. So I encourage any new exec to get curious and do what I say is go on a listening tour so that you can understand and withhold judgment. And I say that because you might see some things that seem a little out of place or maybe even behind the times, but I promise you there's probably a reason for it, and you'll want to understand what that is. So taking that time to understand more about the organization and its collective norms and its values before you arrive at a conclusion or rush to make change. I think that's just such important advice. I'd also add, even, going a little deeper from a change management perspective, something that may not be a best practice, but is embraced by the organization requires a completely different approach if you're going to affect change. So even if the change is warranted, your ability to implement those changes is often contingent on your ability to get alignment. And actually, Robert and I were talking about this. I'll share an example that I think demonstrates how deeply held beliefs can be present. And in this example, they were present in a compensation and benefits philosophy that a new executive didn't immediately recognize. So as I mentioned before, I worked with G3, G4, and G5. And so I had some historical context around some of the programs that we had as an organization. It definitely helped me a lot in my role. And as we started to recruit from outside and certainly bringing in people from non-family held or certainly the publicly held environment, they would come in and they would notice some of the things that we did, and maybe it didn't make sense to them. And one of those things was our profit sharing plan. And they came to me and said, we're not competitive with the outside world because our 401k doesn't match. And most people, and they're right, most people are used to this, 401k match as the retirement vehicle. And so their concern was, it's not like it wasn't a valid one. But what they didn't understand was that the third generation, which I call G3, and the second generation, G2, they implemented that program. And they got together and they created it because for them, what mattered most was that they were helping to set up their employees for a long-term success financially. So they saw that as an opportunity to invest in their employees for the long term. And they were proud of it. one member of G3 that I worked with for a very long time would come into my office and want to talk about it. He loved it. He loved knowing that the employees loved it. And so those were two major constituents that this executive didn't know about. One, they didn't know that I had surveyed the employees regularly, and that was their number one benefit, was the one they liked the most, was our profit sharing plan. And it was also something that had a long-standing, like, kind of heartstrings, if you will, to the prior generations. And so, we were able to collaborate together. And fortunately for me, they didn't go in guns blazing and try to like just wipe it out. We collaborated together and we looked at it through the lens of how do we help educate people around this profit sharing plan, which is far more lucrative than a 401k match. And how do we perhaps even change the way that we arrive at the goal so that our employees understand their part in helping us to achieve it, so that they have greater ownership and connectedness to it as well. And so when we brought this notion of changing it to G3 and to the compensation committee, we made sure that we presented it and showed them this is what we want to present to our employees. And part of it is helping them understand that the generations before, why they put this in place. And it really, honestly, like, everybody walked away feeling good about it. And our employees felt so much more connected, I think, to the family's values. And it ended up being a real win-win. And so I think the moral of this too is that was something that could have been really sticky because of the longstanding ties and the connection to it. And don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So make sure that you know what those things are before you go recommending change.
Yeah.
Shawna, what I like about that example is that it starts out looking like a compensation issue, but it really goes to one of the, I'll call it a scorecard that the family's keeping. They want to have they want to reward long-term employees. They want to create long-term security. That's important to them. So it moves from being an item on the income statement to really a part what I call the scorecard. And I think that first 90 days, Christy, back to the question, it's really important to explore what is the family really going to measure at the end of this year or at the end of next year, and getting a better understanding of what I call the scorecard, some financial and some will not be financial.
Yeah, it reminds me, I sometimes say that, like, there's not a brick in the house that got there on accident, right? So everything in that organization, it served a purpose. It was reflective of a particular design. It doesn't mean you don't have to renovate the kitchen, but everything got there for a reason. You really have to consider that. And the other thing that your story reminds me of, Shawna, and I think it resonates with why so many of us enjoy working with family businesses, is so many family businesses are so successful because they do things differently than the rest of the market. They differentiate themselves in how they think about culture and benefits and how they approach the market and how they treat their customers and all those things. So embracing those differences as a new leader and seeking to understand them, I think that's a real advantage for both sides. So moving on then, let's talk about managing down. Serving as a non-family executive also presents some unique dynamics in that context. So let's start with family employees in the business. What should a new executive keep in mind about managing family employees?
Such a great topic. And you mentioned before about, long-term employees that are often in the family-held business. I think it's a hallmark of the family-held business. And the organization that I worked with for so many years, I mean, I was one of the members of the 25-year club, and we had more than 50 people that either had retired or were still working in the business that had been with that family's business for more than 25 years, which I think is really, truly remarkable. And it's because they do things differently. But in the family-held environment, family working in the business can mean many things. And so, obviously you have siblings and cousins, you have that bloodline family. But I also encourage any non-family executive to keep an eye out for those long-term employees. They're members of the team, maybe they've been there a long time and they're treated like family. And so, oftentimes those individuals have worked alongside maybe more than one generation and have been in the trenches with them as the business grows. And so the sense of loyalty and duty that the family might feel towards that person, those long-standing ties, can form family-like bonds, and you don't want to overlook those. And, it's terrific when that legacy employee has evolved and that they've grown with the business and the position that they're in. But I also caution, when the needs of the business have maybe evolved beyond that person's ability, You as the non-family executive may need to be prepared to find an alternative approach for addressing that. You know, in other organizations, they might say, oh, you're no longer, you know, working well in that position, et cetera, and we're going to move you out. You may not have the opportunity to do that in this kind of an environment. And you need to be mindful of that and really truly look at it through the lens of how can we architect a real solution here. But when it comes to working with other family in the business and certainly the next gen, it's important to get clarity going in on a few items. So in fact, I'd really include this as part of your dialogues during that interview and onboard phase. So in addition to what family is working in the business and the roles that they hold, I'd absolutely inquire about any employment guidelines or expectations that the family might have established when it comes to family working in the business. Do they have established norms when it comes to performance or career pathing or compensation? And if so, are those norms enforced or carried out by who? And if not, what's the family's expectation? And especially for that executive, where does their authority begin and end when it comes to addressing things like maybe poor performance of a family member? And then the other thing I'd look at is what processes are in place to career path that next gen coming into the business and what's been effective to date in supporting growth and development. It may be different than what you expect. So good to get clarity around that. And also to find out, have we been successful in finding that intersection between talent, ability, and that business need? So really important things I think to consider and to go into on the way in, asking about and looking into, because non-family executives can play a really important role in mentoring family and the next gen coming into the business, but they're only as effective, honestly, as the support that they have. So Robert, what else would you add there?
I like that perspective. I think from the seat of the non-family CEO, again, it takes some time to understand what the expectations are, but I think that's really the heart of it, is what are the expectations around the next generation and family members in the business? And that what is that expectation from multiple layers? What is it from the generation above them? And what is it from their point of view? And there's a lot that can be done to create an environment, to steal your word from earlier, Shawna, of curiosity and engagement with that next generation. What I find most exciting is when the environment can be set so that there's a natural exploration that begins with the next generation and that the non-family members that are supporting them start to see that evolve. They see the curiosity, they see the engagement, they see the hard work. And then that becomes kind of a spark that can light the whole process of supporting and nurturing that next generation. So when that next generation is set up, whether they come on their own or it comes through family policies that have helped them see the roles that they should play, or from the senior generation, when they're set up and that sort of natural progression slowly happens, I think then that this next generation development can really take on a life of its own, and it gets a lot of internal support. It reinforces itself. I think in situations where there's misalignment of expectations, it's more challenging. And I think it's very challenging to set up that positive environment. It has to be done deliberately. But when there's a misalignment, it really is going to take communication from the senior generation and that next generation is what are you there to do? What are your goals? Do you want to advance? Do you see this as a position where you can be happy doing things that are in a certain role, make your contribution, and have the non-family members or other family members play different roles? So really getting into what makes you happy and what engages you here at the business and what are you good at and how can you make that contribution, I think can be important ways to kind of unravel those situations that there might be misalignment of really expectations and unneeded pressure sometimes on those both generations to see things happen. So I've seen this in an area where outside independence, if there's outside directors, for example, contributing to this conversation, it can be, and that can be directors, board of directors, advisory board members, or outside advisors and consultants. And Shawna, you mentioned it. I think family policies that have been developed and shared for some time period prior can also help kind of align those expectations at multiple levels.
Yeah, I agree. I'll also share, I chaired the family mentoring team for the family that I worked with. I onboarded along with this family mentoring team, 10 members of the 5th generation. And that it ended up being, I think, a helpful process for not just career pathing, but maybe even addressing performance, for addressing compensation. And it was very formalized process that, we had a charter and an operating agreement, but that family also had family employment guidelines. And so that next gen understood what was expected of them, one, vis-a-vis the family employment guidelines, and two, it helped them understand what the non-family executive via this family mentoring team, what our role was, and how we were there to help and support them, and at times to be an intermediary if there was a need for it. But you touched on process, Robert, and sometimes setting up these kinds of processes can also really help preserve that family harmony when everybody's working together.
I love that example, Shawna, and I appreciate that you guys have hit so strongly on mentoring as a component of this relationship. I know we've seen families who make that an explicit part of the sort of screening criteria for non-family executives and for independent directors, right? They see these people as people who are business role models for younger family members, and they want for them to have a natural orientation towards mentoring. And in situations where you don't have perhaps all of the policy or structure or clarity of expectations that you may have, somebody who just really wants to contribute in that way can go a long way to bridging the gap between, what the family's looking for and what they're looking for. And Robert, you're touching on curiosity, though. I was thinking about that as, I have not heard that specifically called out as something to look for in a non-family executive or in an independent director, but it seems like a wonderful trait to, reinforce that idea of coming in and learning first and really trying to understand the system that you're in. I want to take a quick break to remind people that we're going to go to Q&A in 10 minutes or so. So this is your time. Pop your questions into the Q&A segment. We'll be ready to answer those and continue the discussion based on what you guys want to hear about most. And then we'll go on to our next bit of the conversation. So now that you've got an executive on board, they are learning, they're building relationships with owners, with the board, with the executive team. They begin to see the company's path forward, and they may see that they need to renovate the kitchen. They may see that they need to change the organization in some way. What should those people keep in mind in leading change in a family-owned enterprise?
Christy, I'll start out and just say this question reminds me of that old saying that I embrace change as long as it doesn't happen to me. And I think in some ways, to the example that Shawna gave earlier, it's one thing to come in and have that non-family CEO and any new leader take the reins and steady the ship, whatever that means and whatever the situation is. But as that person starts to get their understanding and build a team and starts to see differences in the strategy, I think it really can cause some ripples within, the way that things have been done in the past. I'm reminded of operationally of a strategic discussion that I was involved with as a non-family business leader, where after several years, the management team decided to make a shift from focusing on, a B2C customer base, a consumer retail base, to a wholesale, a reseller base, a B2B. And the discussions were there. The transition was successful. The board had engaged in that process, but it wasn't until somebody said no in the system, where a phone rang and said, I understand you're not selling to this type of customer, or the pricing is this way, till really that happened and it became really evident and externally that whole strategic shift kind of came to pass. And it was different from the founders, and it was a different path from the years prior. So that sparked a much deeper and engaged conversation around that same topic, even though the implementation had already started. So I think as that non-family member does go into those changes, realizing that even the impact of those changes might not be visible until they're visible. It's a conversation until it's visible, and being okay with trying to test the waters there and make those changes. Another area, and Shawna mentioned this earlier, is around compensation, and really variable compensation, where a non-family CEO might feel the need to shift some of the variable compensation factors to shift focus of the business. And in that example I gave, it could be compensating on different types of customers, for example. But in the process, sometimes that requires sharing financial information. So both the idea of changing compensation, things that might be near and dear and very important, but also then tiptoeing into sharing additional financial information about the company, which there usually are concerns there. There is, the desire for privacy. So really blending and how to find that balance between motivating employees by sharing information and changing compensation, but also respecting privacy and the confidential information of the family can be another area.
Yeah, Robert, I agree. I've experienced this as well. I think that sometimes the non-family executive coming in from especially like a public environment or even a private environment that's not family held, it's a little surprised about the confidentiality aspect. And, family helds are often very sensitive around a few things. One, their customer relationships. It seems to be a hallmark from my experience. And the other is around their financial information. And they're protective of that oftentimes. And I realized, I was having a dialogue with our executive leadership team, which, by the time I had kind of moved my career towards the end, there was a combination of those of us that had been with the family for some time and some folks that had come from the outside world. We were talking about how do you rally the employees around our goals for the business, and how do you get them really engaged in understanding their part in controlling costs and in driving bottom line value when you can't share the financials. And so we would have these, employee quarterly meetings where we would talk about, we're X% to our goal, which is good information for them to have. But what was even better information for them to have were areas maybe where we had expense that they could help control, or ways to drive value in our product offerings, greater yields with our products, greater, quality and food safety in the product. And it meant you had to be able to share certain elements of information that the family was a little bit uncomfortable with. And so we arrived at what we called an EBCO. So we didn't speak in terms of net income. We didn't talk about, here's our revenues, et cetera. We talked about it in terms of EBCO, earnings before key obligations. And so it was our own little moniker. We rallied our goals around EBCO. We tied EBCO into our profit sharing contribution. And it allowed us to speak about key elements of the business from a financial perspective, while preserving the privacy element that the family felt so strongly about. And so again, I just encourage that non-family executives, sometimes you're going to have to find some unique solutions. And again, I think sometimes it can be a real win-win, and it can be a competitive advantage. So EBCO.
And Shawna, I think just to piggyback on that, a lot of times the family's values are around trust and loyalty. And I think that balance between sharing the financial information and trust and loyalty is really delicate. But I, like you, felt it was like a lightning bolt, and I was managing a construction products company during the recession of 2008 and 9. And once we had a crisis, financial crisis, but once we shared the financials, everybody understood why. And it was a way for engaging around that. And I like the idea of that EBCO, of taking and maybe finding a middle ground where a lot can be shared, but there can still be some buffer with some of that confidential information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's real creative problem solving. And it strikes me as a hallmark of a little bit of this transition that we're going to talk about next, which is when you move from a family member being the person who makes all the decisions, and there's a high level of confidence, and they're they have their hands in everything, to a non-family member, that can be a bit of a transition. So many non-family executives are the first in their post following a family CEO, for instance. So what other special considerations would you highlight for someone who's stepping into those big shoes?
Well, I think Robert's going to have a lot of great counsel for us on this one, but What I would say is, filling big shoes can be daunting for anybody for sure. And so I'd encourage anyone in that situation, bring your authentic leadership to the table. Stepping into the shoes filled by another doesn't necessarily mean that you have to emulate their leadership to be successful. The family chose you for a reason. They believe that you're up to the task because of who you are and the experiences that you bring. So absolutely leverage that. I also think it's really helpful to see yourself through a stewardship lens. You weren't necessarily brought in to start this thing and be the trailblazer, but you definitely are going to be the steward of it. And what got us to this place may not be the strategy that can get the business where it needs to be in the future. So that also means that you may be called upon to shepherd the organization through change, and that's going to take a lot of courage. I personally think a servant leadership mindset and solid stewardship principles and your authenticity are really the best tools for navigating that terrain. Robert, you've absolutely been in this place, so I can't wait to hear what you have to add.
Well, those are great points, Sean. I think, Christy, I might change the question from big shoes to big hat, if that's okay, and really talk about 3 hats. I think following a family leader, that family leader was wearing 3 hats in that business, most likely. The business leader, but also maybe de facto the family leader and the ownership group leader, and that could be reflected through the board of directors. And I think as a non-family member picks up one of those hats, the business hats, it's very possible that that leadership component that was the function of leadership inside the family or at the board level and getting unity, getting goals, maybe just confidence in not asking questions, but confidence in the process. There can be gaps there in the family and at the ownership level. So I think the non-family members should be aware of the need to seek that clarity and support the family or the owners getting that guidance. And the flip is that as that family member transitions out, and depending on what that transition looks like, it might be into one of those other roles, but if it's transition out of the system, really having the family and the ownership group recognize that they have also lost something that right now might not be replaced with that non-family leadership, that family leader. So really asking the question and getting it out there, is this a gap in leadership in the other arenas? And how will that impact us if we don't address it? But more importantly, how can we begin to address that and recognize it?
I think that's where we start to see families thinking about different governance models, right? How do we put the right set of supports around a non-family executive, thought partners, collaborators, and people who can step into those gaps? Perfect. So then as we close our conversation, we're going to go to Q&A in just a moment. But let's reflect a little bit on what we've shared about how to help non-family executives be successful. How can families who are planning for this non-family executive, particularly that transition from a CEO or a key leadership level, how can families prepare for their success?
So, Christy, I'll pick up and maybe kind of slide in from that last question too, because I think the preparation begins with really thinking about some of the structural elements. You mentioned a family council, but this non-family executive will have and will build a management team. But I think building that family council, a forum for the family to have one voice, to gain information, to give input, and communicate that in a single voice, to another structure, which would be a board of directors or a group of owner representatives for the owners, are fundamental structural building blocks that will facilitate this transition in many ways. I think another step is going to those groups, if they exist, and really getting clarity of goals. As the owners come together, maybe in the absence of a strong family leader or an owner, really having difficult and new, not difficult in the sense that they're impossible to have, but challenging. What do we really want? What are our goals? What do we believe in, and how do we want to get there? And then the third is having a feedback process. The non-family CEO will not hear the voices in the family, will not hear the voices of the owners, and ensuring that that person is getting good, candid, look over your shoulder type of feedback that can help them see their blind spots, can help them see the areas where they really need to be more savvy, aware of what is happening inside the business, the family, and the ownership group.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Robert. I think I'd frame it up this way. One, the family has a really unique role in defining what success looks like. And so in terms of what they can do, I'd start there. What does it look like for the family? What do they agree on? How is it going to impact or influence the way that that executive shows up? And getting clarity around this is really important. And then the other one would be alignment. So alignment around who are the key decision makers and who's the voice back to the executive so that they're really clear and can be in lockstep with how the family has defined success. And then the other thing I would say is a commitment to working through the processes that have been agreed to for dealing with that ambiguity or the challenges. And I really think that having some solid processes and defining success at the front end is just so critical for a positive outcome.
Thank you both. I'm going to share a little bit of information just before we go to here's my technical issues again, just before we go into our discussion. You will receive a feedback form. So we do ask you to take just a moment when you receive that to share a few thoughts about your experience of the conversation today. It's also an opportunity to ask for follow-up from us. If you'd like to talk directly to Robert or Shawna as a follow-up, learn more about their work, put that in the form as well. We'll make those connections for you. So we appreciate your feedback, and also it will help set us up for future programs. Also want to share some additional reading. Robert recently wrote an article on how non-family CEOs can serve as a bridge between generations. You can find that on our website. You will also see that in the post email from this session. Learn more about Robert's experiences working with non-family CEOs. Our next webinar is coming up very soon on June 5th. The topic is Let's Talk, Productive Money Conversations in Family Enterprise. We're hoping to give people some ideas on how to start these very important conversations in healthy and productive ways with their family. You can find that on our website in the resources and webinars area, or again, your email after this program will include a link to register for that program. Lastly, we've got some other resources for you, including we've got 2 educational events coming up later this fall, one for family governance leaders and family members who serve on family councils, and one called Family Directors Essentials, where Shawna will be faculty, sharing best practices for family members who serve on their family boards of directors. So check those out as well on the website. We'd love to see you there in the fall. Those are virtual programs, great learning opportunities that we've run over the last few years. And with that, we will go to our Q&A section. There are a couple of conversations in the Q&A about the actual recruitment process, and I think it'd be good to touch a little bit more on how families can effectively recruit a non-family executive. What advice would you have for them? One of the questions in the chat was specifically about using a retained executive search firm. So what comes to mind in terms of advice for families who are going out to make this first big outside hire?
Robert, I'll let you lead this off because you've actually been in that predicament of being the person being sought after. And then I'll chat maybe a little bit about from the HR side, the things that I thought through when I was working with an outside firm.
I think the challenge in the recruiting process is recognizing how important the cultural match is with the non-family executive. And I've heard many clients and colleagues say that they really wish they would have started the recruiting process sooner, and that's years sooner, not 1 or 2 years, but 3, 4, 5 years sooner, to allow for some aspect of gauging the real person behind the CEO. That genuineness, that ability to integrate, that ability to have that sincere sense of learning and ability to engage around the family, that could mean bringing them in that person in a year early for a transition, or have someone being recruited from within to start that process sooner, where there might even be a lot more data around, what is this person like as a human and how does that fit into the culture? So I think that's one blind spot I think that some of the recruiting process may include, is that there's the industry part, there's the business acumen, but the long run might really require the human cultural fit with the company, and finding a way to test that, I think, is critical.
I would agree. I would also encourage any family that's going to be working with a retained search firm, and I think that there are plenty that are really terrific. But I think you really need to do your due diligence there and make sure that you're working with one that understands just how important that cultural fit is, which means that they need to take the time on the front end. And by the way, if they are coming in and talking to you and all they're talking about are the skills and the job description, et cetera, that right there should be maybe a pause kind of moment. Because I think the really good ones are going to come in and want to understand the family, what their values are. They're going to want to understand the cultural norms within that business. They're going to want to understand who are the key players and the expectations. They're going to have the insight that maybe there are going to be some expectations of the family or the business that might be different than what you would experience in the outside world. So for example, I worked with one family that wanted to go to the outside world for a CFO for the first time. And I made a very strong recommendation that they work with a particular search firm, because I knew that this person was going to take the time to understand their unique differences and also help them understand that what they called a CFO versus what the outside world called a CFO, and the tasks that that person might do, that there were probably some level set that needed to happen there. In that particular environment, the owner did not have any expectation of his CFO signing checks. So that was his prerogative, but the person doing the search that I recommended, I knew that this individual would get to the heart of those kinds of things to make sure that the person coming in understands some of those unique value propositions, and also at the same time educating the family on what a CFO might expect. For instance, the CFO might expect to sign checks. So being able to facilitate conversations and get clarity there around what matters to both be it the position or the way that the company operates. I think a good retained search firm, one that really does specialize in this area, can be really helpful.
And Shawna, your point also brings up that the non-family executive is going to have access to a lot of information about the family, not just financial, and that ability to be in that sphere of family information and out of the sphere, working in the business and really being able to compartmentalize those for the good of everybody, I think is another. I think you sort of touched on that with that financial example.
Yeah. And the fact that you may not have complete access to all the financials, maybe not right out of the gate.
Right.
And that, don't be offended necessarily by that. So a really good retained search firm can also help, I think, foster a good understanding between the two.
Thank you both. I've got another good question here in the chat about, and this is a fairly common little sticky wicket for non-family managers. How do you approach when you have entry-level family members who are owners, but also report to non-family managers or who are colleagues in an organization? How does everyone help to bridge that little bit of complexity?
Well, if they don't have family employment guidelines, which can be really helpful for the non-family executive. I know in my own experience, I worked with the family committee of our board and said, hey, as the person who's responsible for a good portion of this, there's 26 members of G5 that could be coming in here. What's your expectation when it comes to these things? So that helped me tremendously in my role. If you don't have that, then I would encourage get a little bit curious, like I said, about what the family's expectation is, but also see yourself through the lens of the mentor. Sometimes they're coming in and it's not easy for a seasoned family member that's been working in business and as an owner and maybe even has the hat of a board member to always remember when to take off their different hats. So somebody newer to that experience and younger in their career, have a tiny bit of empathy, enter into that from the predicament of I'm here to mentor and help you to be more effective with not just recognizing when to take the hats off and on, but how it might shape your identity and your professional brand when you forget which hat you should be wearing at any given time.
I'll add to that I think it's important that just as a baseline, that family member is doing productive work for sure, and that the manager is managing around the productive work where the goals are clear. There's a goal in this department, there's a goal in this division to get this done. And I think that level of mentorship can possibly succeed when those goals are clear. There's clearly a co-shared goal. I think where it gets more challenging is outside of that, where some of the development is not around the work and the tasks, but around the person, maybe in a softer skill set way they approach situations, decision making, critical thinking, engagement with others, team or leadership skills. And I think that's much more difficult for the manager. Those goals are not as clear. But as we talked about earlier, that person might not see themselves as wanting that feedback or might not be part of it. So I think if that's the type of mentoring, I think it's valuable to step outside of the management-employee relationship and really bring in some outside help. That, again, an area possibly for a board member, independent board members, which normally we say, it's board members don't dig into that level of the operation of the business, but that's an area where their expertise can make them natural mentors and respected. Or engaging, just third-party help. Could be consultants, could be other advisors somehow to really give that soft side feedback outside of the business scope.
I think a human capital committee of your board can be a helpful place for that. The human capital committee, we called it compensation committee at the time. Any kind of challenges, maybe with family working in the business, that was kind of reported there, and they had a place and a role in helping us navigate that. So can be effective.
So I'm noting that there are a lot of questions in the chat. So I want to point people to a couple of resources that you can avail yourself of after this program. There are a lot of questions around family employment policies, a lot of energy around that. We've talked about that as a really important tool. That is an area of work sometimes with families. It can be a few conversations to get through understanding what we really want from that. You can go to our website and look for family employment policy. You'll find articles and resources. If you want to learn more about family employment policies, by all means, put that in your form after we log off today. Let us know. We can follow up with you. There's also quite a bit of conversation in there about the interaction between non-family executives and family board members. Again, the program that Shawna is doing in the fall for Family Director Essentials, that's primarily for family members in that role, but there's a lot of good understanding built about how family directors who may or may not work in the business can interact well with the organization and be effective there. So that is something to check out. I'm going to ask one more question to close today, which I think is a good one. As we talked about change management, there's a question raised about how managers, how executives who are non-family in the family enterprise deal with the blending of emotions and reactions that they may get around change in families. So sometimes families recognize that change is important and yet have an attachment to one or more things that are how we do things now. What advice do you have for non-family executives in that situation?
Robert, did you want to read that off, or do you want me to?
Start it out.
Well, obviously, I think change can be challenging in any situation, but like we talked about before, if there's these maybe nostalgia or some of those things that are pulling at it as well, then it's going to make it even more difficult. In my own experience, we took that opportunity to bring forward those elements that we knew really mattered. So whether it was talking about the family, making it part of the story, but finding that win-win, the change too doesn't necessarily have to be a 180. So sometimes I would caution you about change being too much too soon. Baby step it a little bit and do your best to bring forward those things that are maybe core values. Make sure those things still shine through so they see that continuum of old and new, still having elements that really resonate and matter to them.
Yeah, I like that, Shawna, a lot. I was thinking in those times of challenging change, going back to the vision, the mission, but being very willing to reinterpret that. You know, if innovation, for example, is a core concept and a core belief that's been held, that need to innovate needs to be kept modern, needs to be kept current. So having the dialogue around we're preserving innovation by changing innovation, or we're preserving taking care of the customer by changing the way we take care of the customer, I think is the most productive way. And to get this idea of the past was how we developed it, but in the future, the vision we have for the future, it's going to have to be applied in a different way for our success. So I think linking back and really clearly understanding that common goal, that vision, and what those words are that have to have a life. They have to be interpreted in today's terms and in really looking forward into tomorrow.
I like that, the idea of articulating what we want to preserve as much as what we might want to change. And if we can keep our eyes on both of those things and recognize the things that we are preserving as we go, that's a great way to address that. Well, we are at our time. So this is the point where we say goodbye for today. And we hope that you will all come and join us for another program. Robert, Shawna, thank you for being with us today and sharing
Thanks,
of your
Christy.
experience, your experience with families. It's been a wonderful conversation. And thank you all for joining us. We hope that you'll be back with us for our next program, and that we'll see you again in the future.
Thank you.